Cool. So we have quite a few people here already, so we'll get started. I'm Kenzie, and I look after the public sector for Toy2. This is the first of an ongoing webinar series that will aim as an ongoing educational piece for the public sector, both our clients and people outside of our current programs. Rania and Helene both have expertise in the public sector and across our programs and science-based targets, as well as Scope 3 screenings. So they'll be the main speakers in this kind of ongoing series, as well as bringing in some people along the way. So I'll just intro them now, and then I'll hand over to them. So Rania, do you want to kick off?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Great to see so many who joined today. I want to keep this very interactive, and as Kenzie mentioned, this is part of a series of webinars that we're delivering, specifically targeting public sector. Any questions or anything that's unclear, please just jump in either the Q&A box or in the chat function. I'll be keeping an eye on those, and then we'll get your questions discussed through. Feel free to as well to, if you have any examples from your own organization or a kind of a tricky thing you're battling with at the moment, please don't hesitate to bring those up so we can discuss them through as well. My colleague Elaine here will start off talking sort of generally about Scope 3s, and then we'll go in a bit further to some standard changes that are coming up next year. So I'll talk those through. But again, please don't hesitate to break in and put any questions or comments either in the Q&A or in the chat. There'll be lots of time at the end as well. Very keen to hear your feedback. The whole purpose of these webinars is to make sure that we educate the public sector and make sure that you have all the tools and skills necessary. So we are super keen to make sure that we cover on the things that you want to hear, that you're interested in, and that you're wondering. So please don't hesitate to put in a feedback as we go or at the end. And we're hopefully can we bake that into future webinars. And so I'm going to hand over to my colleague Elaine now.
Thank you, Rania, for the great introduction and also just reinforcing that interaction of the webinar. So, Kiara kato ko Elaine toku ingoa. So, as mentioned by Rania, this is the outline of the webinar today. I do hope all of you can see my screen and you can follow the slides as we go through. So, we'll be sort of covering the most common measured indirect emission in the public sector context. Then we'll be covering a little bit about how to get started on measuring those indirect emissions and what are the most common methods that you could be referring to and also using as you get started on those indirect emissions. We'll also talk a little bit about some differences within the sector, and then I'll hand over back to Rania to go into a bit more detail on the new ISO standards and really get into more information to you on what it will mean and how you can start preparing for it. So some of you may already be familiar with this very commonly used figure from the greenhouse gas protocol value chain. So when we do begin measuring our greenhouse gas emissions, most companies who will publicly be reporting are very likely to be reporting on their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions that you can see in the middle. So Scope 1 emissions are all the direct emissions of all of the things you own and have direct control over. So they'll be thinking, you know, about all your fleet vehicles that you can own or have a really long-term lease over. It would be natural gas and boilers that you may be using on the sites that, again, you rent the building or use it. Could be also refrigerants from the building you do operate from, and some rental cars and things like this. Your Scope 2 emissions will be really looking at just mostly the electricity used that's coming from someone else and that you do use on your site. So most of you would already be reporting and measuring those emissions. But as you can see on this lovely chart, there is a wide range of additional categories from your value/supply chain. And those are generally split between upstream categories and downstream activities. You will notice that there are a couple that have been circled in red. And for anyone who has already been through the TOI2 Carbon Reduce or Carbon Zero program, you will know that those are the ones that you tend to measure through our program. And those are 3 to 4 categories out of the 15 value chain emission. So when we do think about Scope 3 emission, as mentioned, through the TOI2 program, we have a couple that all our program members will be measuring on. These are mostly the one you tend to have more often the data available, and also you generally have some level of influence a little bit more than some other Scope 3 categories. So on the screen, you will see freight and couriers is one of the ones that most of our clients will be reporting on. So that's really just anything you sort of pay for in terms of transportation of a good and a service, and that you move around the country and pay for that freight movement. We also look at the waste sent to landfill. So really important, we only focus on landfill waste in terms of mandatory Scope 3 emissions. And then one of the big one is all the business travel. So that's considering all of your air travel that's taken and paid by your company, any taxi, any sort of mileage claim, and really just travel done on behalf of the company just to get to a client or to deliver a service. Another one that is a mandatory Scope 3 emissions is around transmission and distribution losses. So that's another one that companies are reporting on. Sometimes it might be something that's not material, but it is something that we're getting companies to report on more and more in terms of when you get your electricity delivered to you, there is always some transmission and distribution losses, and it's about accounting for that. On the left-hand side, and we will get into more detail on that, you get a little criteria on when to decide on some of those value chain emission and why you might decide to be reporting on some of those. So they are the sort of question you sort of want to be asking yourself when you are deciding whether to include those emissions. So do we have the ability to influence those emissions? So sometimes you might decide that you have a greater level of influence and you should really be reporting on those because you are really a big influencer over those emissions. Are they going to be a big part of your emission footprint? So again, as carbon becomes a little bit more mainstream and more companies are reporting on it, a lot of them are realizing that their Scope 1 and 2 compared to the Scope 3 is very small. And so they're really realizing that actually the Scope 3 emissions and the supply chain emission are representing about sometimes 60 to 70% of their total footprint. So because it's such a big part of the emission, they've decided to actually start reporting on those significant other Scope 3. Another big player and reasons behind adding some of the Scope 3 supply chain emission is also how important is it to your stakeholder. So really starting to think, if we were not reporting on this, how would our key stakeholder feel? And would they feel that maybe we missed out on a big part of, and is it a risk part of our business not to be reporting on it? An example I generally really like to use, and feel free to jump into the chat and add some of those and you're not too sure on how you are deciding on whether to include it or not, but would be Auckland Transport as a really good example that I do tend to use quite a lot. So as you can imagine, Auckland Transport actually contracts out most of the bus transportation, right? It's actually handled and through a contract from a third-party company. And so when you think about Auckland Transport, you would expect as a stakeholder, a general member of the public, that they would be reporting on those bus emissions, right? Because it's part of when you take public transport, it is what you jump in. And if you all of a sudden saw a footprint of Auckland Transport and there was no bus emission, you would really think it's quite risky not to be reporting on those. So they took the approach saying, yes, it's more of a level of influence, and actually we might not be able to control them as much as our scope 1 and 2 of the vehicle we own. However, we will be reporting on it because it's really important to us and we can still think we can influence it. Another one that you can see on screen is activities that you used to do in-house and for different reasons you started to outsource them. So that could be for, just efficiency, just a different business model. But I guess when you think about your supply chain emission, you really want to be representing how your business operates, okay? So if you used to mow the lawns yourself because you maintain a lot of properties, and you all of a sudden decided to outsource it because it's just more efficient. Thinking about, well, can we actually influence those emissions, and should we still be reporting on some of those?
Ellen, I've got a question come in that I thought we could just answer quickly. And so the question is just around if there's a percentage threshold that should be followed when to decide if you should include a scope 3 emission or not. And I guess I could talk from a program perspective. And so we generally ask organizations to include scope 3 emissions if they are greater than 1% of the total footprint. So for every one given source, you can exclude it if it's less than 1%, and that's out of the total measured emissions. But you want to make sure that you don't exclude more than 5% of your total footprint. So if you have a large amount of small scope 3 emission sources, you just want to make sure that you keep within that 5% and not exclude more than 5% of your total footprint. This is both from our program, but this is also recommended by the ISO standard as well as the greenhouse gas protocol. So that's usually the kind of guidance that we give.
And I'll probably add to that as well, more from, the Science-Based Target Initiative, I guess. If your scope 3 represents more than 40% of your emissions, you will need to be managing and measuring those scope 3 and have a target against it. So it's really about trying to assess exactly how much is it likely to represent. And if it ends up in your top 5 emission, then it's really something you should be measuring or at least assessing. And we'll get into some method and some quite high level method to get started really and get that estimate on, is it interesting or is it worth us spending a bit of time on assessing those emissions. So we thought we would just detail a little bit within our client that are currently on our program, what are the most common indirect emission sources that are being reported on? We split it in about 3 categories just to sort of try and go a bit general about the most common ones. So we'll get into that just now. So for the DHB, they actually report quite on a range of value chain scope 3 emissions. And these are, have been decided within the industry and within discussions, and also based on that criteria on significance and stakeholder point of view as well. So one of the most recent one, and not all of the DHB are reporting on it, is the number of meal they're actually serving up. So again, this is something very specific to DHB. They do provide quite a lot of meal, and whether you offer meat-based, vegetarian, vegan, or fish, it has quite a different percentage of emissions associated with it. So they wanted to start tracking this to see the impact it's having and where some of the reduction opportunities may be. Another quite common one is accommodation. So that's really whenever you're on a business trip and trying to track the number of nights you're spending overseas or within New Zealand. The next one on the list is around office paper. So office paper may not be a significant part of your emission, right? When you compare it to natural gas, fuel, and electricity use. Quite often what we've noticed, it's a really important one for stakeholder and mostly internal stakeholders. So it's a really good way to start engaging with your employees. And when you do track on paper and something they can hold on to, you can start really reducing those emissions and really raising awareness around emission measurement and management. So quite often we go off purchase quantities because that's probably the easiest way to actually be measuring the paper consumption. And it's quite a common scope 3 additional that we see our clients reporting and tracking. The next one is around patient transport and commuting. So again, when you start thinking about the level of influence for the DHB, they have a lot less influence about the patient transport and the commuting of the employee, right? You can provide them with some guidance, provide them with some for example, providing them with a bus card or a few public transport trips, but you can only influence those emissions. For DHB, it was a really important one to be tracking because they think they can still manage to reduce those ones. So that's one that they've decided to take on board and start reporting on. And the next two is water and wastewater as well. So just looking at how much water use they're having throughout and how much wastewater is being produced from the facilities. DHB reports on even more scope 3. So again, I mentioned before that we do report on waste sent to landfill. But as you all know, there is quite another a big range of waste emissions, right? So you're going to have all of the sort of medical waste that needs to be handled differently. You might also have quite a lot of garden waste if you're looking at big areas, again, that you maintain or a third party maintains on your behalf. Some food waste as well, and sometimes wood and other material. So that's something that companies decide to be tracking simply to be able to see the progress of their waste diversion strategy. And same with recycling. So recycling is an additional scope 3. This is simply because when you think about recycling, it's the right thing to do in terms of minimizing the impact on the environment. But in terms of emissions, it actually has quite a high factor associated with it because, as you know, to be processing recycling plastic and glass, you do need quite a lot. It's quite energy intensive. So actually, when people are tracking the recycling, it might be increasing the emissions. However, it's still showing that you can reduce some of the waste into landfill and increase your recycling. So that can be an individual company decision to be tracking that. And the last one is, that commuting side of things. So when you do, depending on where you work, depending on the sort of opportunities for commuting to work that you have, you can start influencing your employees, especially with now working from home. You could really have some great incentive about how people get to work. The location of your office or your business is going to make a big difference. Is it close to public transport? Can we, have an incentive where we pay for the bus transport for our employees? Could we have some, rebate to purchase an e-bike because a normal bike is not the easiest way for people to get into work? And so you can start influencing those employee commuting emissions. Again, assessing first whether it's material and whether it's a big part of your emissions is going to be really good, and then deciding the strategy on how to manage those emissions. In terms of council's common scope 3, so we'll be finding that office paper across most of the public sector companies, because it's just one of the common one. Public transport, so sometimes they might, be able to control the public transport that's being provided, and so they might be tracking the bus use and the train. So that's one of the common one in terms of councils. You'll find recycling again, that yes, they've made the decision to be reporting on. Accommodation as well, and that one that was touch based on, so the contractors' fuel and waste emissions. So when you think about contracting out some of the activities associated with what you're delivering, you probably will outsource some of them. So if you think, for example, of I'll go back to probably mowing the lawn and having someone external delivering that for you. So that contractor will be using fuel to get to the site, and also, probably using fuel to mow the lawns and also create some waste. So thinking about whether you have some level of influence over those emissions, and if you want to be tracking them, would be a really good process to go through. Some contractors may do very little work for you, and therefore, might not be significant, but you could be working with some key contractors and they could actually influence those emissions significantly. Rania, do you want to respond to that question that was just posted?
Yes, I've got two actually. Yes, so I'm going to start with the property question here. So I've got a question around, what does property companies include in both development of new sites and long-term lease sites? So usually what we see is that if a property and a company that owns property also has some kind of management of that building, they will usually include the electricity and the waste from the common areas of that building. And so what that means then is that any tenants, whether those are businesses or private people, they will most of the time have their own electricity contracts. So they will be including that. So your tenants will be including that. So that will be under sort of excluded from your inventory. And there are cases, however, where you might have a contract where all services are included, so your waste, electricity, natural gas, etc. In that case, if there is no easy way of splitting out what is tenant use and what is your under your responsibility, we usually recommend that you would include all the emissions associated with that. So if you're in control of the contract, so whether it's waste or electricity, then we recommend that you include that. So that's for your operational emissions. When it comes to development of new sites, organizations are increasingly evaluating the emissions, what we call embodied emissions of a new building. And so that's usually done pre-construction phase to understand what are the embodied emissions going in. So what's the carbon intensity of the materials that this building is built out of? And I don't know, I think we have a little note about it. Some of you would have noticed that MB has a consultation out at the moment around both operational emissions of buildings, but also around embodied emissions in buildings. So if you're keen on that, I would really recommend you submit an opinion piece. I think it's closing on Sunday. We will certainly be putting in a Twitter response on that. Primarily focusing on the operational emissions, but the embodied emissions is becoming a lot more I guess, a lot more focus on the embodied emissions. What I should say as well, if you're in a program, we do have some organizations that will include their embodied emissions of a building in their inventory. They're either including them as what we call a one-time activity source. So during that time that the building is being constructed. But what's even more common is that you might want to try to estimate what the emissions of a building is, but you don't want to include it under your certification, so your carbon reducer, carbon zero certification. So you will include that information in eManage, but you'll set it up as a separate business unit. That way you can share it with your team, but it won't necessarily be part of your ongoing inventory. And the main reason for that is because in the carbon reduce and carbon zero programs, we're looking at your operational emissions in a given time period. And so quite often we kind of set that embodied emissions aside. However, and we'll get into this when we look into the new standard, there are some changes around that, so that I'll cover that in a little bit more detail then. And then I've got another question around the public transport. So if we look from a council perspective, we do have quite a few councils that will include public transport emissions. So that is when public transport activities are outsourced. So if I take it from a Wellington perspective, we've got Metlink, that is the contractor for public transport activities, and that's contracted out by Greater Wellington. And so in this case, the council wants to include the public transport emissions, although they're not directly responsible for the day-to-day running, they are obviously sort of I guess the main responsible, and so even though they've outsourced it to Metlink. And so they're including those emissions as part of that, and for a multitude of reasons. But one of the key things there is that, of course, the more you include under your inventory, the more attention you can bring to it. You can bring it back to your team and influence those services over time. For example, looking at how are your contracts drafted? Are there any parameters that should be included around carbon intensity or delivery or quality of service when it comes to environmental impact, etc. So really, it's kind of going back to what you measure, you can manage. And so, and then the other part of it as well is to look at the materiality, which Ellen touched upon earlier. So for public transport, for a council, public transport can often be quite a large, significant source of emissions. And so discussing through with your team about are we responsible for those emissions, and if so, should we be including those under our footprint? And also just to kind of finalize that question, there's also a question around employee. That's another thing that we see organizations include more and more. Obviously the COVID has probably put a dent into employee commuting, but employee commuting is becoming something that organizations want to keep track of. So to give you an example here from Toitu, we go through a staff survey every 2 years, I believe it is, or every year. Where we check how people travel to work, what are some of the kind of main barriers or I guess parameters making that prohibits people from traveling on a more sustainable, active mode of transport. We also look at the distances people travel, carpooling, etc. And so, and then we estimate the emissions of our staff commuting based on that. It's a great opportunity for us to also capture information around how people prefer to, whether they want to prefer working from home, going to offices, sharing, etc. So, and then that's really for us to understand the full scope of our emissions. And so we make our employees go to work every day, so we want to make sure that we know what the associated emissions are of that. And especially for organizations that are reporting according to the greenhouse gas protocol, you'll very often see that there's an employee commuter category there. And keep in mind though, if your main offices are in the hubs, so Wellington or Auckland or Christchurch, quite often the employee commuting emissions are de minimis when it comes to your total footprint. But if you feel like you've got a large pool of staff that are driving to work or traveling quite far distances, then that could be something that you can investigate. And you can do that quite crudely as well. You could just do some estimates and say, we think we have X amount of people traveling X amount of kilometers per day times this many working days per year, and do some very crude emission estimates there.
Actually, I wanted to add to this that we actually do it twice a year, that survey,
Twice
just
a year.
to be
Oh.
capturing the winter commute to work versus the summer, because when you think about all the people actually cycling to work, quite often it goes a bit down over winter. So we actually try to do this twice a year to be able to see the difference and see whether, the weather is having an impact on those commute emissions.
Yeah, and we're obviously we have 40 staff, so it's a bit easier. For those of you who have a very large staff pool, I would recommend that if you are curious about this, you might just start with start yourself, try to build some estimates, and have a look. Have you got any other staff surveys coming up that you could potentially bake in some travel survey into? You can, of course, also do it sort of a voluntary type survey, asking around, getting some, take some key people in your team or in different teams and just get a feel for how people are traveling and build some estimates on that. And I guess, the purpose behind looking at commuting is really about understanding as well, how can we improve our employees' health? Are they traveling to work in a healthy and safe way? So it's more than just that carbon aspect as well.
And I also think it goes back to that paper indicator, it's something people can relate to. So if you're able to put into emissions, their commute to work, and we do have a public calculator, and I always say to people, if you want your staff to be able to understand the emissions of the company, maybe a really good way is for them to capture their own emissions and the way they get to work, the waste they produce at home, the air travel. I think it's a big eye-opening how many tons of CO2 do you get from flying from Auckland to Wellington. And as you understand your own emissions and how those little things add up, you then start understanding a bit more about the mission of your company and how you can start helping. And there is that really engaged workforce that's really behind you and really supporting you in your own journey and your own reduction plan.
We've got Ellen, have you seen the questions here?
Yeah, so I guess that's a really common question in terms of where an organization chooses to include an emissions over which they have influence. How do we ensure that the emission isn't double counted in the provider's footprint? It's quite common, and as we get into the supply chain and value chain, this will happen. The thing to keep in mind is there will be different scopes. So if we think about that that bus transportation, right? So if you are the company influencing it, you will be reporting on this emission as a scope 3. Whereas that provider who owns the bus and runs it will be reporting as a fuel used as a scope 1 and 2. So I always try to go back to what do we want to achieve? We want to be reducing those emissions. So I think it's always better to double count it and have 2 people working on reducing those emissions rather than saying, well, actually, I have no influence, I'm not going to be measuring it. So really trying to think, well, I prefer to be influencing those emissions, reporting it as a scope 3, and work with my supplier on reducing those. And so hopefully in the long term, we really get that reduction going. So yeah, that's my approach.
Yes, in a perfect world, every organization will know their carbon footprints and will only have scope 1 and 2 emissions. But unfortunately, that's not the case.
Yet.
And Manoy, I've got a question here from you around the new standards. I'm going to put that question on hold, and we'll get into that just in a second once we've gone through some of the scope 3 questions here. So I'll just keep your question here and I'll answer it in a very soon.
Thank you for all the great questions. Please keep them going. I'm sure someone else has wondered about it, and it gets some really good discussion going. So please continue bringing on some really interesting questions. In terms of central agency common scope 3, so we'll find again that accommodation side of supply chain emission due to generally quite a large part of the emissions are associated with business travel and air travel. That office paper is coming back as well on how to, engage with your employees and track internally and move to more of a web-based use of your business. And also with COVID and more, we do start thinking about those working from home emission. We actually just received from our team a really interesting white paper on capturing those scope 3 emissions. So we'll make sure following onto that webinar that we do share it with you, because it will become something more and more, businesses are thinking about a different way of working, and a lot of employees will be working from home. So how do we capture that? Yes, the commuting, if you were tracking it, will go down, but then what about those emissions from working from home and having an office that might be empty and still using some sort of, and producing some sort of emission? Some other scope 3 we do get a lot of question around, and again, it's more sector specific, so data centers, so if you are maybe a bank or maybe a web-based service, you're quite likely to be having a few data centers, maybe in New Zealand or maybe even overseas, and that's going to be a big part of your emissions. So how do we start capturing those emissions? What are the best practice? And Google has done a bit of work on that, and you can find online a little bit of thinking around capturing those data center servers emission. Freight is a really big one, and probably one of the trickiest emission source I've seen to be measuring, just because of reports. And when you think about a little package that's traveling throughout New Zealand, knowing where it's been and how much it was weighing and what mode of transport was used, and who's responsible for those freight emissions. So in terms of carbon, we generally go back to who pays for it, so and who has that control over the insurance of the goods and the decision over how is it being transported, how quickly, and when do you want it traveling through is going to be the key questions to be asking around freight. T&D losses I've touch based on, and then IT equipment, which within those supply chain category fits within those purchased goods and services. So thinking, okay, as we get more goods and services, how do we start capturing those emissions, and what's the best way to be tracking all those equipment and goods that we do purchase? And then getting quite a few questions also around leased asset and any outsourced activities. So really just want to go back to the slides, which I think is really the one you want to have in the back of your mind, or even set it up as a checklist when you have those individual scope 3 supply chain emission. What is the likelihood size of those emissions in comparison to the rest of the emissions we've already been capturing? What are that risk influence factor that we do have over them? What would a stakeholder think? A lot of companies do report on emissions in terms of ESG reporting and some of stakeholder requirements. So what would your investor, supplier, customer think about when you do present your emissions profile? Those outsource emission and any sector guidance. So that's another thing I've mentioned a little bit. Data center is quite applicable to some specific sector, just like a bank or a web-based company. What are your industry specific? And that can be quickly identify by looking at your competitors and having a look at, internationally, those companies who do report on some Scope 3, what are they reporting on? And what are some of the ones we could start looking at within our own company? So just really wanted to go back through those 15 categories. So, we've touched base a little bit and quite a lot on employee commuting, a little bit on transportation and distribution of the things that gets to you. And then there is also the downstream, so whatever you're sending off. So when you think about maybe a fashion business, all of the clothes they're sending through to their customers and things. And we'll just go into a bit more detail on some additional of those Scope 3 categories. So how to measure those indirect emissions. So that's really where a lot of clients and non-clients are really getting stuck at. So as we know, those emissions are generally the Scope 1 and 2 from another company. So what is the best way to actually even start assessing those indirect emissions? So one of the way to get going is to do what we call a Scope 3 screening. Okay, so it's about really trying to map out your value chain to start understanding, and that's specifically to, for example, category 1, which is purchase goods and services. So supply chains are dynamic. We do understand that. And it's going to be almost impossible to achieve 100% of completeness. We do understand that. And most companies who do report on the supply chain emission will make it very clear that it's generally based on probably a snapshot. And one of the ways to go with either the suppliers you have a really good relationship with, or you've chosen because they've actually already done something about emission measurement, or also just going over who do we spend the most with. So starting to create a list of all of the things that you spend a lot of money on, or the suppliers you do order a lot from, and just from the supplier type that this would be something that could be a significant part of your emissions. So there is different methodology to assess those emissions. So the first one is to do an emission-based screening. So it's really thinking, okay, within the suppliers we do work with, do we know if they are on their own journey to measure their own emissions? Can we start a conversation with them to try to get their Scope 1 and 2 emissions profile? So start asking them whether they have the ability to be sharing sort of any information around what they do. And the beginning of the conversation might be that they never really thought about it and they only have, for example, instead of fuel, kilometers traveled. So that's a really good type of secondary data. It's still something you can work with and start doing some assumption and estimate of those emissions. You can also use some proxies. So if the company you work with has a very common profile and different companies that could be quite similar in the way they operate, you could be using that data to actually apply it to the supplier who may be at the beginning of their journey. The second most common first step to measuring your Scope 3 emission is to do a financial-based screening. So it's really about getting to sit down with your finance team and starting to get an export on all those GL code that are part of your financial system. So you might start ranking how much you spent in terms of purchases, and start rating it from the top to the bottom and associating it with what that spent may be. One of them could be around uniforms, for example. You might be spending $1 million a year on getting uniform for your employees, and you could match that spend with the right category. And the last criteria is, using some sort of sector, information. So for example, you might be using an industry average that's currently available, or you could use, for example, environmental product declaration that give you a profile of something, and you could use that to start assessing those emissions. And quite important that one solution does not work every time. So very often, and I'll show you the next slide, it's a combination of those that give you the best result. And some categories work better with a financial-based screening because of, for example, purchase goods and services. You might have many categories, and you might really be getting goods and services from such a range of things. So financial-based screening really helps to help you prioritize it and put what's material first. Another example is those one with the other criteria, so for example, category 10, processing of sold product. So if you think you are a manufacturer of cars, for example, and you do want to be assessing your category 10. So what are the emissions associated with, category 11, with the use of that vehicle? So you will be, for example, using an average fuel use of the vehicle during its lifetime. So you know that, the vehicle has a lifetime of 15 years and is likely to use that much fuel, and that would be what criteria you'd be following for that category. In terms of category 12, so for example, you have a sold product. A good example is Fruco, one of our clients, right? So they do soft drinks, and they wanted to sort of understand what happens at the end of life of their product. And so they did a bit of an assessment of what was the recyclability of their product and how would people likely dispose of it. Okay, so they ended up with a sort of an estimated of how much of it ends up in landfill and how much end up really actually being recycled. And from that, they were able to get a really good picture of the end of life product, and therefore estimate those emissions associated with the treatment at the end of life. So all of the scope 3 screening really goes back to engaging with your suppliers. So we do understand that, it's not always possible to get the information from your supplier, but it's about starting those conversations. So trying to start that engagement with your tier 1 suppliers. So those are really the one you have a direct, purchase order and relationship with, so that you can start influencing or asking for information. We also do understand that that might not be able to be done right now because your supplier is not used to it, has never done it before, but starting to draft a contract and some condition and getting them to understand that that will be the way forward. And at the next renewal, it will be something you want to see, their scope 1 and 2. So it's really about starting those conversations and starting to manage that expectation that you will be wanting to get some really clear data, making it easy for them. So, giving them a really good representation on what you want to see in terms of emissions. You want their scope 1 and 2. You would like to have it in terms of, showing the methodology they followed so that you can feel confident about the data you're getting from them. So really bringing them together and letting them know what's really important for you to be getting from them. And yeah, just already touched based on that, but really asking them for methodology. So there is quite a lot of inequalities in terms of measuring and your greenhouse gas emissions. So you will see, it's a little bit like anything. Once it becomes mainstream, people could be following different practices. And some companies that are carbon neutral could be carbon neutral in their scope 1 and 2 only. And so really understanding what did they measure, what factor did they use, and what sort of methodology did they do to allocate emissions. So really starting to get some detailed information about their emission profile is going to play a really big role. And some of the challenges for collecting primary data. So again, we do know you will have quite a large number of suppliers. They might actually find it, you know, quite hard to be providing you with that information, or they might not even know where to get started. So they quite often what we do see is that supplier may get a little bit defensive about actually sharing the detail of the emission, because they might find it as oh, we're getting analyzed about how efficient we're running our business. So really they might feel a confidentiality issue. What are they going to do with that data and things like this? So really that engagement aspect of the supplier discussion is going to play a really big role. So making it very clear, why do you want this data, that is part of your journey, that the confidentiality will remain confidential, you know, and that is only for internal use, or whatever will be published publicly will not be into so much detail as the data they shared with you. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Table 7.8 has some really good guides on how to address some of the first challenges you might be coming across. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has a value chain, you know, different categories, what do they mean and what they should be representing. And they also have a really good guide on how to calculate the Scope 3 emissions. So really a good reference to go back to when you're starting your journey and you want to know what are the things to start to consider. I see there is a question. So we produce concerts in the entertainment sector. Is our audience personal travel to attend a concert or event a downstream Scope 3 emission, and how would we measure that? So that's, you know, I'm guessing the concert might probably, the venue might be the first step of measuring the Scope 3 emission, okay? So let's say you are doing that in a venue that you're renting out. The first step in measuring this emission would probably to start thinking about the emissions associated with that venue that you're renting out. After that, of course, if you want to really start understanding how did the customers get to your event, was your event and the venue really accessible in terms of being central or bus made available, or part of your ticket you get a free train transport. Yes, you might want to start tracking those. One of the way we do that, so we do event certification. So if you've ever been to a Toy2 event operation certified event, sorry, you might have seen that they could be carbon zero. And so what they do is at the registration time, they do ask a little bit of information on where people are coming from and how they're planning to actually get to the site. And then it's a little bit of data crunching. So you make some estimation, okay, if people are coming from outside of Auckland, they're likely to be getting to from the airport to the city where they're staying with, you know, a taxi or public transport. So you do some assumption about how they might be likely to be coming. So yeah, surveys also at the door or at the event. So just getting a little bit of an idea, even if it's 20 people out of 100, to get a bit of a sense of how did people come to our event, and was it easy to get to it? So that on the first year might be, you know, only survey information, but on the following years, you might be able to actually get a lot more clearer and precise data. I will now hand over to Ronya to continue the information on the version 3 of our standard.
Thanks, Hélène. I am actually going to share something really quickly before I do that. And that is sort of just a bit of a reminder. Let's see here. You can see my Appendix 1, Ellen? Yep, okay, great. So there, if you're in the Carbon Zero or Carbon Reduce program, there is a template that's called Appendix 1. And so it's a bit of a workbook that can show you how to compile information from different sources. But it's got this de minimis tab. And the reason we call it de minimis is that's what we call anything that's not material if you're in the programs. And so you might hear us talk about de minimis, and particularly when the auditors are on site, they might talk a little bit about de minimis. And so what you want to do is, if you have any tricky Scope 3 emissions and you don't really have any information on it, your supplier isn't responding to you, but you're still kind of interested to understand what the emissions might be. I recommend to use our de minimis calculator. You wait until, do all the easy emission sources first, do all the stuff that you have information on, and wait until the very end until you've only got those really tricky bits left. If you can't find any information from your supplier and they're not responding and you sort of feel like, oh, I don't really know what to do, you put in your total emissions inventory that you would have got from eManage. So in this case, I'm just going to put in 1,000. You then go to your accounts team and you ask them how much you've spent on, so in this case, we'll just do, for example, fertilizer in the reporting period. So important that you just then make sure that you've got the right reporting period so that accounts only pull out the particular period that you're interested in. And then what you do is you just fill in and say, well, we've, so we're going to do with a dollar spend one. So we spend $5,000 on rental cars. What this will then tell you is that makes up about 0.12% of your total footprint, and therefore you can include that as an exclusion. And you include, in the emissions inventory report, you then put a little comment in there to say that you've excluded it. And what many don't realize is that there's actually quite a long list of different sources here. So there are sort of more generic categories, but it can be really useful for you if you're just trying to understand, gosh, yeah, I think we spend a lot of money on insurance and other things. You can fill in some of the total dollar spends in here and it will give you an estimate of what the emissions are. It won't be accurate. The emission factors are a dollar spend emission factor. So what that means is it's sort of from a national perspective broken down to a dollar figure and estimate. So essentially estimating the emissions per dollar spend within that particular category. So they're not aimed for precise carbon accounting. They're aimed at trying to understand what are some of these areas where potentially we have a lot of emissions, we just don't really know about it yet. And so it's identifying what are some of the main groups that we might need to spend a bit more time on understanding the emissions, and then go into some of the steps that Ellen talked about, identifying who are your suppliers and how can you engage with them. But so that's a tip. So your account manager can give you this. It's also available in the resources page on eManage if you're in our programs. So that's just really useful to know that it's sitting in there. A lot of people don't realize. So anyway, that was that. I don't think I have any questions. Just going to double check that I don't have any questions around the Scope 3s. I will sort of continue to cover on Scope 3s, but we'll be talking a little bit more about an update to the ISO 14064 standard, which is the one that we're using for the Carbon Reduce and Carbon Zero programs. So you might have heard about it. We are certainly starting to get a few questions about it. And so up until now, we've been using the ISO 14064-1 standard for carbon accounting. That is globally the most commonly used standard for organizations that want to verify their footprints. The other main standard out there, which is, or I should say guideline document, is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And And so what has happened is that they've updated a standard, and so starting from mid next year, we'll be starting to transition organizations to the new version of the standard and essentially sort of phase out the 2006 version of the standard. For our program members, it won't be that different. The software will automatically do a lot of the changes to your inventories, which is really nice. And then of course you've got your account manager sort of helping you throughout the process of some of the changes. But the absolute main change that I want to talk about today is how we talk about scopes. And so currently we refer to scope 1, 2, and then 3. But under the new updated version of the standard, we'll be talking, and then I should say as well, in the programs, we've had scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then we've had that set of mandatory scope 3 emissions, which are freight, waste to landfill, and business travel. And so that language is going to change a little bit, and it's going to move over to be scope 1 and 2 emissions, but then also your significant indirect emissions. And so very much what we've just gone through here about trying to understand where are some of the main indirect emissions in your inventory, and should you be putting a management plan to reduce those? So should you work with your suppliers to reduce those emissions? The other main thing there I should mention as well is that the language is going to go from scopes to categories. Scope 1 and 2 will be exactly the same as in the past, just that they will be referred to as category 1 and category 2. So that's very easy. In terms of what they include, they are exactly the same as well. So that's really just a question of semantics there and changing over from scope to category. And then in the scope 3 area is where it's broken down to 4 categories rather than just sort of a generic scope 3 indirect category. So as you can see here, we've got transportation, products used by the organization, products used from the organization, and then other indirect sources. So transportation, products used by the organizations will be used by majority of you guys. Products used from the organization will be a little bit on a case-by-case basis, designed mostly for organizations that produce some type of product. So looking at the use phase emissions of that product. Say, for example, you're a producer of washing machines, so looking at the emissions of the use phase of that product. And then you have your other indirect, which is essentially your miscellaneous of anything that kind of doesn't really fit into the other 2 categories. So that's going to be the breakdown. And then of course these categories here, you'll be looking at what are some of the sources that are significant to our inventory, and should we be including them or not. So if you're keen on understanding that already, you could go in and have a look at the de minimis calculator, plug in some total numbers for in dollar spend for your organization, just speak to accounts, and then they will give you those figures, and then you can sort of understand. So for example, your DHBs, you might be interested in some of the consumables that you're using or the meals, and what the significance of that is in relation to your footprint that you've got currently. For most organizations, it will be those consumables. For some of the central agencies, so potentially some of the IT equipment, you might be curious to understand what that could be in terms of your total footprint as well. And you can of course just do nothing and wait until we start you on this journey. And so one of the questions here, Manoy, that I got from Enjoy was do we need to transition to reporting based on a new standard? And so yes, we will transition all of our members to the new standard sort of starting from mid next year. And what it means in terms of you personally and as an inventory, very, very little for our program members, because the software will spit out all the reports in the same way it has been doing. It will just have scopes as well as categories. So you will have to do very little there. It's really just breaking down your emissions in a different way. And particularly because you have already been including your business travel, your waste, and your freight. And so those will just essentially be going into some of these categories. So I've just got a screenshot here of what a table in the emissions inventory report might look like in the future. And so rather than scope 1, 2, and 3, we've got sort of the broken down by 6 different categories here. And then I've of course got your removals if you've got any forestry or anything like that. If you're curious to see what a report could look like, I've just got a bit of a screenshot here. This is from an inventory that's available online. So you could have a look at that if you're really, really curious. These guys have broken it down by a few different sources. So you've got your categories here as we did on the previous slide, but they've then also gone actually further and broken it down by certain categories. As you see here, it's got employee commuting as an example, and it's got NS, stands for not significant, next to it. So they have sort of wanted to display that we have considered it, but we have deemed it not significant in relation to our total footprint. So that is one alternative that organizations can do if you want to understand what they are, but they are not necessarily that significant to your total footprint. And you kind of want to display that we have actually considered it. The other thing for program members is, of course, your exclusions table in your emissions inventory report. Your account manager can show you exactly where that table is, and that's where you can include and say, we've estimated it, it was less than 1% of our total footprint, so we've therefore excluded it as per the de minimis rule. So that just gives you a little bit of an overview of what that could potentially look like. And you see here as well, they've got the purchase goods and services. So they've just kind of wanted to break it down a bit further. And that's sort of a preference thing. So each organization have the freedom to break that down however they prefer. So the key things to consider is that if they're relevant, they should be included. If they're significant, they should be included. For a lot of organizations to start off and to understand that, again, do some screenings and understand what's the impact of these. We do see a lot of organizations as well, including things that are not necessarily significant, but they are significant from an engagement point of view. So they're either a risk item, or you have some people in your organizations that are very passionate about, say, waste, for example. So for a lot of office-based organizations, waste is actually a insignificant source, but they want to include it anyway because they think that it's a great opportunity for them to engage their staff on. A lot of people are very passionate about waste, so they use it as that engagement pathway. The other one is office paper, the same. It's very often not significant in a footprint, but people are very passionate about paper use. It's an easy way they can see how they're not printing as much paper anymore, and so they can make that bridge between greenhouse gas emissions and activities that they're doing in the organization. And so we do see that a lot as well. So I wouldn't say that you need to shy away if it's not significant. If you think that it's relevant for other reasons, I would say that you include it still. And then we've got here, so that was a question that we got earlier, was around if you can exclude them if they're not deemed significant. There are some cases as well where we work with organizations and they might be starting off their greenhouse gas journey. And in the first year, some information is very difficult to obtain. So they might start with a very rough estimate in the first year, but then over time, they'll set up strategies and programs to improve data collection, and that is very often just talking with suppliers and have sort of a mutual understanding of what do you need in your report, so whether that's your purchase reports or invoices, so that you can more accurately estimate your greenhouse gas emissions. If you are excluding something as well, then that should be justified. And so that's one of those examples where, for example, there is no information or the supplier was unreachable or etc. Then as long as you make sure that you clearly justify why things have been excluded or why things have been estimated, and that should be all included in the EIR report, so your emissions inventory report. And then as you've got the last bit here, and that is simplified estimation methods for understanding what's significant. Don't spend hours and hours and hours on trying to estimate things that are not going to be significant. That's why these dollar spend emission factors were developed in the first place. It's just to try to make sure that you can sort of categorize what areas are there in our indirect emissions that could be significant. And so rather than that, it's rather just how can we identify which ones potentially are big and how do we focus on them, but not developed to give you an accurate picture of that inventory. So that's for those who love detail. I would just give that as a word of warning when you are starting using dollar spend emission factors. It's an estimate to try to make sure that you know where to focus your efforts, but not an accurate account, as we can do with your scope 1 and 2 emissions and some of your scope 3 emissions where you've got great supplier reports. I've got a question here as well that I am going to have a look at. Yeah, so this is around water consumption, and that is, we see more and more organizations looking at that. So if you're a office-based organization, if you're including water and wastewater, what you're essentially doing is you're looking at the electricity emissions associated with pumping the water from the water treatment plant to your offices. And then there is a formula, and this formula is available at the Ministry for the Environment's Emission Factors set, where you can then also, if you want to, estimate the wastewater emissions. So that is essentially the water emissions then of water that you've used going to treatment. And that's a function, so it's a little bit less than what you've used. And some organizations do that. They are extremely often very insignificant in your total footprint, but some organizations like to do that. And the main reason is exactly what you're asking here, is so that they can build engagement on water use. So you can then, because if anything, it makes you track the water use. And so you might not necessarily be that interested in the greenhouse gas emissions associated, because that is likely to be very small, but you're interested in understanding how much water you're using and try to build engagement and reduction activities internally to reduce the water use. And so I would say that's probably the absolute most common reason why organizations are including water. Councils, however, that are operators of wastewater treatment plants and water treatment plants, they are including wastewater treatment emissions in a very different way. But so if you're, say you're just you're renting an office, renting a property somewhere, and you want to include the water and you're not operating a wastewater treatment plant or a water treatment plant, yes, you can include those as an engagement piece. But again, I think majority of the times that we have estimated it, it comes out as a very, very small portion of your inventory. And that's sort of everything we had from us. There's been some really good questions come through. Feel free to fire them through. I'm kind of happy, I don't know if we have the ability, Kenzie, you might know, to open up. I'm happy for people to either type in their questions. Feel free to also let us know if there's anything that we haven't covered that you'd like us to cover in a follow-up session that we're scheduled in, or if there are any topics as well that you feel like this would be really interesting to know more about. Then please put that in the comment section as well. So we'll be running these over a few months now, and the whole idea is that we have topics that are relevant to you guys. So there is quite a lot of room for, say, the audience to form how we develop the webinars and what we actually cover in those webinars.
It's not letting me open up to everyone, but if you guys just want to shoot any questions down below, like Rania said, that would be great. And
Thank you for your feedback.
In the same email that most of you would have received the announcement of this webinar, there's the same registration links to the upcoming webinars. And like Rania said, we're really keen on your feedback, so happy to kind of change it up as you guys see fit in the public sector's needs.
And sorry, you may have mentioned, but this is being recorded and will be shared as well with the attendees.
Yeah. And you guys
Yeah.
are welcome to share it with your colleagues as well. Definitely want to have the most information accessible to everyone. So.
Yes, we'll share the material. We're also going to be sharing the working from home emissions white paper that we think is really good. So that's a recommended read for everyone. We'll include that in the follow-up email as well.
And the links to the greenhouse gas protocol, which is quite a long document, but really interesting thoughts and examples and best practice approach.
And also feel free to, if you've got any colleagues that are really interested in your organization with greenhouse gas accounting, or feel free to bring them along to following webinars as well.
Great.
Cool. Well, we will leave it here. I think the next one is the first week of December. I believe it's December 5th. I'll have to fact check myself on that one, but you guys will all receive a notification and we'll follow up on today's content. Thanks so much for coming, guys, and thanks, Helene and Rania. It was really great information, and looking forward to the next one.
Oh, we've got a freight question. I think we should cover it off because freight is one of the trickiest areas when it comes to greenhouse gas accounting. We deal with freight questions on a day-to-day basis. I'm not sure we have all the answers there, but I'm sure we can give you some input here. Yes, so this is a constant struggle. So the question is how to estimate freight emissions when the supplier reports don't include any weights. Elena, I'm going to jump in and then I'll let you fill in as well. I'm sure you've got some great feedback there. One thing that we quite often will do is, and it's unfortunately a little bit of a pragmatic, practical way, but it's to look at what are we actually sending or what are we actually purchasing, and potentially do a sample. Say you have 100 shipments a year. Will you take out a sample of that? So if you think that 20 would probably give you an okay picture. And then unfortunately, it's just manually going through and look at what are some of the average weights and distances for that particular sample. And then you can extrapolate out for the reporting period. And this is one of these perfect example and demonstrations of where in the early stages, you probably have to do estimates. But then one of the very strong recommendations I would give to you is to then set up a data improvement plan. Work with your freight providers. How can we get this information into your reports? We are working with quite a few freight providers and they are acutely aware of the problem. So hopefully this won't happen, in 2 years' time. We're talking a year or 2 years' time. This won't be happening anymore. But that's one way of doing it. We do also, of course, you can estimate by dollar spend. It is going to be a very, very rough estimate, but that's the other one if you just want a very quick and dirty sort of estimate. So yeah. Elena, have you got any good pointers as well, potentially?
I think, as Rania mentioned, I think it's really about getting those estimates. So sometimes a company might be able to say, well, if we did spend $5 on a parcel, what is the potential weight associated with that? So looking at the internal systems rather than the freight supplier's report. And really going back to that engagement part of things. So we've seen some really good improvement in terms of data quality for companies who have engaged with freight providers who might be using a software called eRoad. And from that, they're able to now pull some lot more accurate reports. Again, it's a journey. I think we have to really remember that they are on the journey and the big freight providers are really understanding that this has become now something essential for them to be providing really good reports. So really trying to get the best estimate you can and engaging with your supplier so you can get some more accuracy.
And there's also a question in here about our soon-to-come platform for measuring New Zealand supply chain emissions. And this is, I'm putting the pressure on my colleagues. It's supposed to come out in 3 short weeks. And it's a tool that my team has been working on that will help very small businesses estimate their emissions and feed that back to their larger buyers. And so, yes, Tessa, it will hopefully help with this, particularly when it comes to that supply chain. And it will also help those organizations that might not necessarily have that much resource and sort of very small enterprise to estimate their emissions, but also sort of compare themselves to other actors in a similar size or a similar situation to themselves. And that should also give some of the larger organizations with a lot of suppliers a much better overview of what their supply chain emissions are. So yes, stand by for that. I think it's, if no delays, it should be out in the next 3 or 4 weeks or so. And I think there would have been some information in our newsletter, so you can check out on toitu.co.nz. There's some information on the new tool that's coming out. All right, well, I think we're going to wrap it up there. Great questions, everyone. I'm really happy about the engagement. So thank you very much for that. Looking forward to the following webinars. Please send through any feedback or anything you'd want us to cover. And have a great rest of the week and weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.